It was the night before Christmas in Anaheim, California, 2011, where 26-year-old mother of three Za'Zell Preston and her newly wedded husband were out enjoying their first Christmas Eve together as a married couple. But all was not as merry and bright as it seemed, and the very next day, on Christmas morning, authorities would arrive and discover a house of horrors. Because while Za'Zell was sitting on the sofa watching her children open their Christmas presents, something was deeply wrong. She wasn't smiling or interacting with her kids at all as they were holding up their toys to show what Santa had brought. She didn't reach out to hug them. She didn't speak a word. Her beautiful children hadn't realized that Mummy was dead and dressed up by her husband to make it look as though she was still alive on Christmas morning. Za'Zell Preston was propped up on the sofa, sunglasses on, murdered. This is the heartbreaking story of a young mother who was just trying to make Christmas a wonderful time for her three kids, and instead she was murdered under the mistletoe. This series is intended for educational purposes, to memorialise victims and to amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. Before we get into today's episode, I do want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Skillshare. It's no secret that I love to learn anything and everything through Skillshare these days. I use it for both my personal life goals and my work life. And lately, I have been using it to become a visionary on Canva. My team and I love using Canva. We use it for thumbnails, we use it for presentations and vision boards. We use different fonts, images, designs. We're a very creative set of girlies over here. We use Canva for so many different aspects of creating the content that you see. And thanks to Skillshare, I have recently tuned into a class from Maggie Stara called Social Media Content Creation in Canva. Maggie teaches a super easy to follow step-by-step class, and she can help you whether you are brand new and literally never even heard of Canva before, or if you're used to it and you're wanting to learn some more advanced techniques. She teaches things like design and thumbnails and social media posts and integrating Canva use into your business and even how to use it with AI. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes taught by industry experts. And there are classes on so many different types of things. I mean, I love all the creative classes like creative writing, illustration. You can learn all sorts of social media-y type things like editing videos if you want to become a YouTuber, or if YouTube and social media isn't your thing, there are classes on how to become a freelancer, even classes on like how to cook, how to be more productive. Literally, the list is endless. Their lessons are uniquely curated to help you master things at your own pace, and master them you will. And Skillshare comes to my door bearing gifts for my girlies, you guys. The first 500 people to click the link in the description and sign up for Skillshare will get a 1-month free trial. And do you realize how many classes you can get through in a month? It is an insane deal. I think you are insane if you don't take it up. So remember, the first 500 of you to click that link can claim that deal. And thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into this episode, I do have to warn you that this is probably one of the most disturbing cases we've done all year. This one really got me. And I talk about these kind of cases week in, week out, and this one made me cry. Like, it kept me up at night. I haven't stopped thinking about this poor woman. So I wanted to say that much in the beginning, especially because if this one really affected me, the true crime girl that does true crime all the time, then I wanted that to be a big warning for you. But of course, I'm going to go through the more specific, sensitive topics that we're going to be covering in this case, and that includes discussion of domestic violence, trauma-induced labour, and details of injuries and murder. So viewer discretion is advised. So now it's time to get into the horrific and heartbreaking case of Za'Zell Preston, a 26-year-old girl who suffered a true Nightmare Before Christmas. On Christmas morning 2011, an ambulance crew in Anaheim, California get dispatched to a local apartment complex. They'd been told that a woman had fallen over when she was drunk the night before. She had hit her head. Her partner was the one that had called 911, and he was saying that he thinks she might have a concussion. As the ambulance pulled into this street, they could see the guy that had called for them standing outside the apartment complex, like waving them over. But as the crew entered this guy's home, something was very off. There was a very sinister air as soon as they stepped through that front door. As the ambulance crew were looking around this home, they saw blood everywhere, on every single surface. There wasn't a single thing in that home that was untouched by blood. It was on light switches, it was on the walls, the countertops, the floors, everywhere. Dried blood, new blood. It was immediately clear to the paramedics that had responded to this 911 call that this woman hadn't just drunkenly fallen over and now she was concussed. There was too much blood in this apartment for it to be innocently explained. The paramedics quickly learned that this woman's injuries went way beyond a concussion. In fact, she'd been dead for quite some time. Her name was Za'Zell Preston, known as Zizi to her friends. She was 26 years old at the time of her death, but she was born on September 5th, 1985 in Anaheim, California, which is where she was born, raised, and stayed for the rest of her life. Za'Zell never knew her father, but her mother, Seidel, gave her the absolute world. Za'Zell and all of her siblings, because she was one of 5, actually, quite a big family. Throughout her childhood, Za'Zell lived between her mum's house, her grandmother Sally's house. She was very close with her grandmother too, and she was sometimes at aunties' homes and uncles' homes. And Za'Zell was such a creative little girl. Right from the beginning, her passion was anything creative. She loved to dance. She loved to create pieces of art, whether it was drawing or painting. She just had so many ideas. She just always wanted to express herself, and I think that's so sweet. I think it's just so pure. I find that we say very similar things about a lot of female victims specifically, that they were such a creative little girl. And I mean, I can relate. I don't know if you can, but I think back to a little version of me, and she was so creative. She always wanted to be painting and dancing and singing, and I love reading about other women that were exactly like that as little girls. It feels like such a universal experience that young girls are just so pure and artistic and sweet and free. Throughout her teenage years and everything, Za'Zell was just a very normal girl. She had a very typical life. She still liked all of her artistic endeavors, but they sort of started to like take a back seat to other things that she was thinking about in her teenage years. You know, boys start to come into the picture and stuff like that. And when she turned 17 years old, her creative pursuits stopped entirely because Za'Zell had unexpectedly fallen pregnant. And you might be wondering, who got her pregnant at the age of 17? And we're not entirely sure, actually. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but for now, just someone. It was 2003 when she gave birth to her baby daughter, and Za'Zell was still only 17 years old herself, but she really stepped up to become a mother. She was really up for this challenge. She got multiple jobs to be able to provide for herself and her daughter. She worked at fast food chains and clothing shops. She even picked up work as a makeup artist, like freelance, and she dabbled in modeling as well. Because, by the way, this woman was beautiful. She was an absolute knockout. She was so stunning, and she knew it as well, which is one of my favorite things. We found this like bikini photo shoot that she had done. She loved using Facebook, did Za'Zell Preston, so she would post all the photos where she looked so stunning, and she captioned this bikini photo shoot mean but sexy with it. I love it. Like, she just knew she was that girl. And I love that she never lost that part of herself, even though she's a mother now. I imagine it's so hard to care for a child and also care for yourself in all of the ways that you always have, you know, like making yourself look pretty and taking photos to feel good about yourself and all of those things that are not necessarily necessities. I just love that even though she was a mum now, that didn't stop her from being the baddest bee in town. And you know what? Za'Zell seemed so happy. She had a baby that she loved. She was really loving being a mother, and the rest of her life kind of carried on as it always had. She still had a social life and friends. Her and her family were super close. And even though she herself was still just a kid, she was very happy with this life that she was building for herself. And then, 5 years later, when Za'Zell was 22 years old, she would become pregnant again with her second daughter. So I guess it's time for us to talk about who the baby's dad is, because now there's 2 babies. And we're not entirely sure if they were fathered by the same man, because there's some conflicting stories. Some people think that Za'Zell had this high school sweetheart that she got pregnant with when she was 17, and they stayed together, and then the second baby was also to him when she was 22, but we're not entirely sure. I believe it was one of her family members that actually said that both of her daughters had different dads and neither of the dads were on the scene. So I'm always inclined to believe family members when it comes from essentially the horse's mouth. And I know we're all very aware of the stigma that is very unfairly placed on women who have children with different dads and maybe those dads aren't around. And this unfair stigma is only amplified for single black mothers like Za'Zell. It pushes this stereotype that Black men are more likely to be invisible when it comes to raising kids and being there for their children, which is just steeped in racism. But, you know, regardless of whether or not her kids had their biological dads on the scene, don't worry, they still had loads of great father figures in their lives, because Za'Zell had brothers and uncles who loved these girls. They doted on Za'Zell's kids. So just to summarize, we don't know who the girls' fathers were, but what we do know for sure is that there were no men on the scene in 2008 when Za'Zell was giving birth to her second daughter. She didn't have a boyfriend. There wasn't a man. So for a short period of time, it was just those 3 girls together. But unfortunately, the safety of that trio wouldn't last very long. And in that very same year, Za'Zell, now a mother to a 5-year-old and a newborn, would meet a man who would change her and her children's lives forever. William Wallace was a 26-year-old dock worker from San Pedro, California. He was 4 years older than Za'Zell, so like I say, he was 26, she was 22 at the time that they met. William's life, his upbringing, his childhood had been very difficult. From what we could find, we couldn't find much information, but what we did find was that his father, William's own father, said that he basically raised himself, which is so sad to hear coming from the parent of that child. So from a very young age, William Wallace was expected to be independent. And so for better or worse, he had a lot of control over his life. But this control would soon find its way onto Za'Zell, and it would quickly become abusive. Merely months after the two of them met, William had moved into Za'Zell's apartment, and she barely knows this guy, but he is inserting himself into her life and into her little family. But you know, she likes him, and she has her rose-tinted glasses on, and when you have your rose-tinted glasses on, all the red flags just look like normal flags. And it was during this time of what's supposed to feel like the honeymoon stage, you know, it's supposed to be blissful, you're walking on air. It was during that he one day switched. William put his hands on Za'Zell Preston, and he beat her so badly that she was unrecognizable when her mum and her friend later found her. Unrecognizable. Let that sink in. To her own mother. How badly must that man have beaten her? She needed hospital treatment. It really was so brutal. She turned up at the hospital with swelling all across her face, her head. Entire clumps of her hair had been ripped out. It was just such an evil, sinister attack on this woman that he claimed to love. And it wouldn't just happen once. This was about to happen to Za'Zell again and again and again. And we don't know specifically what his violent rages used to be about, like how they were triggered, but honestly, with men like William, and as we've seen in recent cases of men like Mike Tyson and Wu Yidong from the Chinese TikToker case, Their anger, men like these, their anger is never really over anything real, nothing tangible. A lot of the time it's things that they've made up in their own head, some sort of jealousy over a man that doesn't even exist, or the potential of another man coming to steal this woman. I don't know. Like we say, we have no idea what was specifically triggering William Wallace, but what we do know is that his rage would be further fueled by a lot of alcohol. The next incident would happen in July 2008. Za'Zell was taking a bath when William stumbled into the bathroom drunk. He was enraged and he was looking for an argument. Za'Zell had seen him like this so many times before that she just wanted to protect herself. She didn't want to join in on this argument. She just wanted to get away. So she tries to leave the bathroom, and as she does, he grabbed her and slammed her by the head against the wall. When she fell to the ground, he grabbed her by her hair and dragged her to the bedroom, and he wasn't even done there. He proceeded to strangle Za'Zell with his bare hands, and then he continued to beat her until she was completely unconscious. And even then, she is completely limp, motionless, unresponsive, passed the fuck out, and this man is still going. He was screaming at her passed out body that he was gonna kill her. And it's so fucking horrifying because men like that mean it. Look how far he took that until she was unconscious. To him, she would have looked dead. Yet that anger is not dissipating from him. He wants to keep taking it out on this innocent woman. So at this point, Za'Zell is passed out on the bed. He is still screaming abuse at her and actually ends up waking her up because of all of this screaming. When she comes round, she's desperately trying to defend herself. She's scratching at him. She's begging for her life. And it actually got to the point where she had to run out of the apartment, and I don't know if she'd even managed to put any clothes on. Remember, this had all started when she was in the bath. Could you imagine having to run out into the streets for safety? She had to run to a neighbour or to a passerby to be able to call the police against her boyfriend, this man that she lives with, this man that she allows around her children. By the time the police responded to this call and got to the house, William Wallace had run away, because he knew he would be in serious trouble. Of course, police couldn't find him at the house, so they couldn't do anything. Za'Zell just had to wait until the next morning. When William returned, she called the police again, and they came to arrest him. He ended up pleading guilty to a misdemeanor in domestic violence, and he was jailed for 19 days. And that's it. In July 2018, he was in and out of jail within a month. I just cannot believe that it was a misdemeanor when he beat her unconscious and was threatening to kill her. This case is a prime example of how domestic violence perpetrators are never taken seriously enough until they actually go out and kill someone, and then it's too late. Like, how much closer could he have actually gotten to killing her on that day? He couldn't have got any closer if he tried. He strangled her with his bare hands. He beat her until she was unconscious and then was still screaming at her limp and lifeless body that he wanted to kill her. So how is it a misdemeanor? How is it only 19 days in jail? How are these police not taking this man so seriously? According to statistics, it takes a woman an average of 7 attempts to leave before she successfully escapes her abuser. And for the next 3 years of her life, Za'Zell was trapped in a cycle of exactly that. She managed to take out kind of like a restraining order against William. It was a protection order. This meant that legally they weren't allowed to be in contact, and that was for Za'Zell's safety. But after his 19 days in jail, William set about getting Za'Zell back. Initially, she didn't want to take him back because, well, why would she? He had almost beaten her to death at least twice within a few months. But he persisted, he kept trying, and soon he would find the perfect excuse to be able to coax her back and convince her that he was a changed man, because he insisted that he had found God. This happened when he was sent back to jail, actually. So he got out after serving that 19-day sentence. He had about 3 months out of jail only to be sent right back in again on drugs charges and I think a burglary as well. So he was back in prison for almost 2 years, actually, from November 2008 till October 2010, and it was during this time that he found God. He was telling Za'Zell that he was now a man of faith. He lived to serve God. He was a born-again Christian. He was filling her head with how he was a changed man and he was going to do better. He was pouring out his heart and all of his love to her. And honestly, this was kind of everything that Za'Zell had wanted from him. Despite how horrible, evil he had been to her, deep down, she was still really in love with him, and she knew that. She had tried to protect herself for a long time, but now she thought she could trust him. When he says he's changed and he wants to be a better man, she believed him, or at least she really hoped everything he was saying was genuine. Because this is a thing where people will go into prison and they will find God, they'll become a born-again Christian, they will be reformed, and when they come out, they're actually determined to be a better person and live by God and become a religious person. It changes people. It really does. But was William Wallace going to be one of those people that genuinely changes for the better? I don't think so. But it had worked on Za'Zell. And while William was still in prison, he managed to convince her to start coming to visit him again. So she would regularly come and see him and catch up at the prison until he was eventually released again in October 2010. And when that happened, of course, he moved right back in with Za'Zell and her 2 daughters. So their relationship kicked into gear again, but it wouldn't be very long before this born-again Christian's halo would slip and the devil would show his true self again. Za'Zell's posts on Facebook once were filled with love and happiness and joy, saying things like, "Today is a beautiful day. It feels so great to find your own true inner happiness." Well, now they'd turned into much more emotional statements, where she would vent about how she felt disrespected and played and lied to. William had begun beating her again. Regularly. And he had also begun cheating on her too, something that she often found evidence of when she would go through his phone. And whenever he was confronted, William would go classic manipulator mode. He would say that Za'Zell was crazy. She was reading into it too much. And for the ones that he couldn't possibly refute, he would try to insist that the woman came onto him and it was all her fault. She was trying to break their relationship up. No matter what situation William Wallace was in, he was always the victim. He was never the enemy. So even when she literally finds evidence of him being unfaithful, he will somehow find a way to put the blame on someone else. In a way, I think he was trying to isolate him and Za'Zell and their relationship from the rest of the world. It was like them versus the world. They couldn't trust anyone but each other, so they should stick together. And the terrifying thing about manipulators is when they use the right words and they play on your emotions, you actually start to believe them. Za'Zell would go and find these women on Facebook that William was claiming had come onto him. They were trying to tear apart their relationship, and Za'Zell would go and give them a bit of shit. Because, think about what she's being told. She is being told that there are so many women out there trying to steal her man away from her. She has been led to believe that he is completely innocent, so she's going out there trying to bat these women away. And she continued to update her status to reflect this hurt and anger that she was feeling over his affairs. In one post, she said, "I don't know why motherfuckers are so goddamn stupid as fuck. People make me want to slap the dog shit out of them." And in the comments of that post, her friends were coming to bat for her as well, saying yeah, why can't these women just go and find their own man? Why do they need to steal yours? Genuinely, William Wallace had not only manipulated Za'Zell to believe that that was the case, but all of her friends as well. Meanwhile, it is literally just him being an absolute rat and playing all of these women against each other whilst living in Za'Zell's house. He had successfully manipulated Za'Zell to believe that the blame should be on other people and not on him, the man that had promised to be faithful to her and broken that promise. It is him who the full blame should be on. And we were actually wondering, as we were looking into this case, if there was kind of a pattern between men who physically abuse their partners are they more likely to cheat on their partners as well? And apparently it turns out that there's not really a known link there, but there is a difference in how physically abusive men will cheat on their partners compared to non-abusive men. It seems that the violent men seem to want to justify their unfaithfulness and their affairs because they feel like they deserve the right to cheat if they want to. And they also don't fear their partner finding out about the infidelity like non-violent men do. Non-violent men will try to cover it up more, whereas violent men don't really care if their partner finds out because, worst case, they will just intimidate them and beat them until it's not a problem anymore. The infidelity just becomes part of the abuse. It all compounds. And William Wallace was just a rotten man in so many different ways. And actually, for the next year of his life, he was in and out of jail for short stints, things like drugs, and, he was just a generally very, criminal man. And every time he would come back out of jail and he would move back into Za'Zell's home with her 2 daughters, let me keep reminding you that he is in the presence of 2 tiny girls, and every time he would come back to that house when he was out of prison, he would start beating Za'Zell again. His abuse would just spiral out of control in front of these kids. But actually, it seemed that at this point in time, that restraining order, protection order that Za'Zell had taken out against him, it actually still legally stood. So every time the police would get called to their house for any different instance of abuse, he would beat her regularly. The police actually had grounds to arrest him every time. Za'Zell did end up getting the restraining order lifted, removed, but it took about a year. And we don't know any other details surrounding that. We don't know if it was her choice, fully her choice, or if she had been manipulated by William to get it removed, because obviously that would make his life so much easier if he could abuse her and didn't get arrested for it every time. And you know what? Throughout all of this abuse, because it had been going on for years, Za'Zell had tried to get away from this man so many times, but William, like many abusive men, he seemed to be a master at apologizing. Or at least manipulating an apology, manipulating Za'Zell into forgiving him. And if that didn't work, he would just beat her and threaten to kill her instead. And that would work. And Za'Zell really believed that he could and would kill her if he wanted to. Because not only had he shown that he was very capable of it, he had strangled her and beaten her unconscious, but even beyond that, he knew a lot of dangerous and scary people. He could even get Za'Zell killed in a way that probably wouldn't get traced back to him because he knows that many people. And Za'Zell is fully aware of how dangerous the men are that William hangs around with, and that scares her as well. There are so many different layers to this. And it all kind of cycles into each other as well, because then the next time that he would beat her, she would forgive him because, well, if she didn't, then the next time he beat her could be worse, or the next time it might not even be him. He might have gotten someone in to finish the job. She was very aware that any one of these times could be the last time. While William was in prison, one of the last times I said he'd gone for 2 years or something, and she continued to go and visit him in prison, it was a lot easier for Za'Zell to almost forget about the terrible parts of their relationship because she would only see glimpses of his good side every time she would go to visit him. And so in her posts on Facebook, she would be practically counting down the days until he was out of jail because she was so excited to have him back. It's almost as if she was trying to convince herself that this was all just a part of their tortured love story, that they were like star-crossed lovers that were gonna be together no matter how hard it got. But soon, their story would take a turn that would bind the two of them together more so than they ever had been. In 2011, Za'Zell Preston fell pregnant with William Wallace's baby. And this actually filled her with hope because she was thinking that if she was literally carrying this man's baby, then he might treat her with more care. He might stop beating her. But Za'Zell was wrong. He continued to beat her. Actually, worse than ever. One time during her pregnancy, she had to flee for safety. She had to run and hide in a grocery store because he was screaming at her and beating her in public. Another time, she was hospitalized for an injured eardrum, we suspect after he had punched her so hard in the side of the head that it had fucked up her hearing. And in August 2011, Za'Zell was now heavily pregnant with his child, and once again, she had to run away from him when he had beaten her so severely, and this time she called her mum to come and save her. And when Za'Zell arrived, she found her daughter laying out in the street, curled up in the fetal position. She was crying, her body was covered in bruises, including her pregnant belly. I mean, how can anyone be so evil as to punch a woman directly in her belly when you know a tiny little baby is growing in there? And it was his baby as well. If he's not even going to kick in any kind of protective instinct for his own baby, then it's a complete lost cause. Za'Zell knew that she was living in hell with this man. On Facebook, she posted, "No matter how much you think somebody's gonna change, things just get worse. When someone has no respect for you, they never will." Za'Zell knew that things had to change. She knew that this had to end. She was kind of looking at her life and realizing that it was nothing like what she had envisioned for herself. She used to be a girl that dreamed of career and of independence, especially a career that would have a lasting impact on other people. But she'd kind of given all of that up because, well, now she just had to worry about survival on her day-to-day. But now she was ready, better late than never, to go out and get that career that she had always dreamed of because, well, really, that would be her first step, or one of the first steps, to being able to get out of this horrific relationship that she was in. If she had a stable career and her own money, then she might be able to run away. So Za'Zell enrolled in Cypress College in September of 2011, and she began taking classes to become a domestic violence counsellor. So this course would not only equip Za'Zell with a very positive and long-lasting career that would help her help others, but it also might help her learn a thing or two of how to cope and stop William's violence while she's still in it. So while Za'Zell would be in school every day, William had agreed to watch her two daughters, who were now aged 8 and 3 at this point in time. But Za'Zell could never fully rely on him. At first he said, "Don't worry, I'll look after your kids." But very quickly, he got sick of staying at home and looking after 2 kids. And I think another part of it was that he just hated that Za'Zell had a bit of independence, that she was doing something for herself, that she was working on herself. And he didn't like that he didn't know who was around her while she was in college. He would blow up her phone all the time, demanding to know who she was with. He would threaten her all the time. And we don't even know the specifics of these threats. He was just always trying to have power over her and keep her down. By this point, his violent outbursts were so regular. He was always taking out every little piece of his anger on Za'Zell, on her body, on her pregnant belly. He was also really trying to isolate her from the rest of her life. She wasn't allowed to go out and see her friends. She was struggling to see her family. She was struggling to even go to college without him blowing up her phone. Za'Zell just wanted it to stop. She was desperate to find a way to calm him down. And so, on the 7th of November, 2011, despite her family's pleas not to, Za'Zell married William Wallace. Za'Zell had really hoped that officially becoming husband and wife, being a married couple, would improve their relationship, especially because a lot of the things that William would get triggered over were like jealousy and paranoia and worries about Za'Zell going off and finding another guy. And so she thought that by completely devoting herself to him in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of God, remember, this is Mr. Born-Again Christian over here, she hoped that he would now feel a bigger sense of security and lose this violent paranoia, knowing that this woman was his wife. But are we surprised that being officially married didn't mean shit to William Wallace? If anything, being married only gave him an even stronger sense of ownership over Za'Zell. He was so entitled, felt so entitled to her time, her energy. And on their wedding night, William beat his wife, Za'Zell, so badly that she went into premature labour the very next day. In a Facebook post just a month earlier, Za'Zell was so hopeful and excited to welcome her first son into the world. It was a baby boy, and she was wondering on Facebook what kind of man, what kind of little boy her son would grow into. As we mentioned in the beginning, Za'Zell always loved art, and so when she was heavily pregnant, she had taken this photo of herself and her bump next to this big mural on the wall, and she posted it on Facebook with the caption, "I love this artwork. It's beautiful to me. I wonder if my son is going to be an artistic person." Which just speaks so much to Za'Zell's character, her strength, her resilience, that she is going through absolute hell at the hands of William Wallace, but she still has hopes for a happy and safe future for her son, for her family. And remember, Za'Zell was one of 5 siblings. She came from a pretty big family, and slowly but surely, she was building that same big family that she had grown up with. But of course, the last thing that her husband, William Wallace, would do after beating her into premature labour, the last thing he's going to do is give her space and peace to recover. Just 2 weeks after the birth of their son, on November 24th, William lost his temper with Za'Zell once again, this time at a family Thanksgiving dinner. And the thing that sparked this one was so insane. So Za'Zell had asked her sister's husband, her literal brother-in-law, to show her how to do something on her phone, and William didn't like it. William didn't like how close her and her brother-in-law were getting. As always, his jealousy and paranoia was never logical, and it couldn't be reasoned with. He was so angry that night that Za'Zell's family said that he looked like he could tear her to pieces. She didn't want to go home with him. By December 2011, Za'Zell was completely broken. She'd given up hope that her education in domestic violence could help her to change him, because he couldn't be helped. He couldn't be fixed. This man was just so evil. Zizi knew that she just needed to pass her exams and get herself and her children the hell out of that house with that man. But devastatingly, time for Za'Zell was running out. On December 9th, just a month after giving birth to her son, Za'Zell was back in hospital once again. This time to get a gash on the back of her head glued back together. Of course, another injury from her husband. This was her husband now. And at this point, the hospital staff had begun to recognise Za'Zell Preston. She was in every other week with some insane injury, whether it was a swollen head or a black eye, bruises all over, and now a massive gash in the back of her head. They were very suspicious that Za'Zell was in constant danger at home, and they tried to involve the police in this, but Za'Zell was terrified of the police involvement because she knew that if William got into trouble, it would only make him angrier, and that anger would be taken out on her. In fact, she was so worried that he would kill her if she ever went to the police and seriously, tried to get him taken down for all of the horrific things he had done to her. And so, in hospital, for all of these injuries that he had given her, she lied to the police and said that she was just attacked by a stranger on the street and she wouldn't be able to identify them, so there's no point even looking into it. And that was that. I don't know if the police believed her. I mean, probably not, but they couldn't do anything. She wouldn't let them do anything. A few days later, Za'Zell was out of the hospital and William had sent her to the shop to go and get some groceries. But when she got there, she realised that she didn't have enough money for everything that he'd asked for, and she was terrified to go home without the things that he wanted. She knew that she would just get screamed at and beaten, and she didn't know how bad it could possibly get because, as we were saying, his anger is never rational. Za'Zell was so worried about going home empty-handed that instead she stood outside of that grocery store begging passers-by for any spare change that they had, because the alternative was going home empty-handed and being beaten bloody by her husband. But even despite all that, it wasn't enough for William Wallace. Za'Zell had either taken too long, or maybe she had returned home empty-handed, because he lost it with her regardless, and he became violent once again. And during this fit of rage, Za'Zell actually called her mum and was begging for her to come and save her, to come and rescue her. And on the other end of the phone, Za'Zell could hear William punching Za'Zell in the stomach repeatedly, telling her to hang up. And her mother, Za'Zell, was too far away physically to be able to do anything, to be able to come and rescue her. And so instead, she called her mum, Za'Zell's grandmother, Sally. And when Sally arrived, the scene that she saw absolutely broke her heart. Za'Zell and her 3 children, one of which was a newborn baby, they were all stood out in the pouring rain, and the little boy who lived next door was standing in front of Za'Zell and her kids, between her and William, trying to protect her. When Sally arrived, she got Za'Zell and the 3 kids in her car and took them away from William. Took them away just for a few hours of peace. They drove to a local mall and just tried to calm down. But that peace and safety didn't last long, because William jumped in his car and followed them right to the mall. He tracked them down and demanded that Za'Zell and all 3 kids get back in his car and come home with him. Once he managed to get them all back at the house, William turned on his manipulation tactics once again and managed to persuade Za'Zell to forgive him. And she did, because, well, at this point, she really actually didn't have a choice, did she? There was the illusion of choice presented, sure, but had she really chosen to not forgive him and to walk away and to try and move on with her life, he would have beaten her, possibly until he killed her. Or at the very least, he would make her life a living hell forever. And that's why it's never as easy as just leave when someone's partner is abusive. It's actually so hard to leave safely and with the rest of your life still intact. A week after this incident, on December 17th, Za'Zell and her grandmother went on a shopping trip. They were buying all the kids' Christmas presents. And honestly, Za'Zell was pulling all the stops out this year. She wanted to make this Christmas the best Christmas her kids had ever had. So she and her grandmother were walking around the mall and they were having a great day. They were having a nice girly shopping day. And of course, William couldn't help but spoil it. He was texting and calling Za'Zell's phone non-stop. He was so paranoid about who she was with. He was already so angry and demanding for her to either come home or for him to be able to come and join the shopping trip. She was literally spending time with her grandma. And when Sally noticed that her granddaughter just couldn't come off the phone because her husband was so weirdly paranoid, she asked her, essentially, like, how are you living like this? And to that, Za'Zell broke down into tears, saying that she was actually fearing for her life as of lately. She felt like she couldn't leave this man, no matter how much she wanted to, because she really believed that he would kill her if she even so much as tried. She told her grandma that she was making long-term plans to be able to leave him. She just needed to get her exams out of the way. She needed to be able to get a job with the qualifications that course gave her. And then she felt like she would be able to, move on and make a life for herself away from William. But both Sally and Za'Zell were terrified that all of that time she thought she had might run out. And just a week later, on Christmas Eve 2011, that time would tick down faster than ever, and their worst fears would become a reality. It was 9 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Za'Zell and William had gone over to a neighbour's house for a little Christmas Eve party, and you know what? The night was going pretty well. They were drinking, they were chatting, they were eating festive foods. They seemed to be getting on fine as a couple, and they seemed to be having a great time with their friends. But after a few hours of festive fun, the two of them would get into an argument, apparently about having left the kids at home. All 3 of them were home alone. Remember, they were 8 years old, 3 years old, and 7 weeks old at this point. And we don't know which one of them wasn't happy about having left the kids at home, but the point is, an argument broke out and the 2 of them left abruptly by midnight. They left in bad moods as well. They left having an argument. And as soon as they returned home, as soon as that door shut behind them, their verbal argument, like always, turned violent. And this altercation actually grew so loud that it woke the kids up. The older of all the kids, the 8-year-old girl, actually came out of her bedroom from her slumber to try and calm everything down. But of course, it wouldn't work. And instead, this 8-year-old girl would witness the most horrific scenes that night. Scenes that a child should never have to see. In front of her 8-year-old daughter, William began violently beating Za'Zell. He was pushing her, punching her, slapping her, throwing her to the ground. Za'Zell was screaming and shouting, asking for him to stop, so much so that the neighbours actually overheard this commotion. I assume they overheard commotion from Za'Zell and William's house a lot, and so they didn't do anything about it on Christmas Eve. And they really should have. By around 1 a.m, the violence had been going on for almost a whole hour, and Za'Zell was beaten bloody, and she actually managed to escape the apartment. She ran outside. And it was at this point that a neighbour actually saw this happen. They were looking out of the window. They saw Za'Zell running out of her apartment. William ran up behind her and slammed her into the ground before picking her up and carrying her back inside of the apartment that she was trying to escape. And this neighbour, again, did absolutely nothing. It's absolutely devastating to think that someone could see that with their own 2 eyes, a woman trying to escape and a man dragging her back, and they just did nothing. They go back to bed and forget that that happened. I mean, it's one thing to do that about a noise when you live near this noisy house and they're always yelling and shouting, but to actually see her trying to run away and being dragged back in and you don't think to call the police, that's insane. I know that some people can be wary of calling 911 for a situation that they've witnessed, just in case they misjudge the situation, they don't want to waste police time. But in a violent situation like this, it's worth calling 911, even if it's only a precaution. But the police absolutely should have been called that night. And if they had, maybe things would have ended very differently. But a 911 call was never made, and no one was coming to save Za'Zell Preston. Now that she was trapped back in the apartment, William cornered her in the living room, and he continued to violently beat her in this drunken rage, and then he pushed her into a glass table. The whole thing shattered underneath her and sliced into her skin from all different angles. And to make this whole thing even worse, William wasn't just traumatizing Za'Zell, putting her through all of this violence. He also got her 8-year-old daughter involved when he ordered her to go over to Mummy and pick all of the glass shards out of her wounds and clear up the blood. What an evil man to get an 8-year-old to try to save her mum like that. She would have been terrified, so scared, not only for her mum, but for her whole family. Why has this man just thrown her mum into a glass table? But all William Wallace cared about was the mess. Was the fact that there was blood everywhere, there were glass shards everywhere. It was an inconvenience, and he didn't want to clean it up, so he traumatized this 8-year-old. And once this little girl had picked most of the glass out of her mummy's wounds, William Wallace then grabbed Za'Zell and dragged her into the bathroom. With her daughter, actually, he made her daughter watch everything that was about to happen. She was confused, she was overwhelmed with fear, and William just dragged her mum into the bathroom, ran her a bath, and dumped her in it, so that all of that blood and all of his crimes could wash away. As she laid in that bath, Za'Zell's body was limp. She was in and out of consciousness. She had lost so much blood, and remember, the violence had been going on for over an hour at this point. She had endured an hour's worth of beatings. Her body was weak. Her body was giving up in front of William, her husband, and in front of her 8-year-old daughter. William was hoping that dunking her into the bath might not only wash away the evidence of his crimes, but maybe even undo them and wake Za'Zell up, snap her out of this daze that she is in because of the hour's worth of violence. But it wasn't working, and so William decided he would try something else. He goes to grab Za'Zell's limp body out of the bath, and as he lifted her up, he slipped and dropped her. Za'Zell's head slammed into the side of the toilet bowl, and she began to make this groaning, moaning, gurgling noise, and then silence. After that, Za'Zell didn't make a single noise. It was now 2 a.m. at this point. William picked up Za'Zell's body from the ground once again and dragged her into the bedroom. He dumped her body onto the bed. He sent her 8-year-old daughter to bed again, and he himself went to sleep. And we don't know whereabouts in the apartment he went to sleep, but it is believed that it was right next to Za'Zell. But the night doesn't end there, and it somehow gets even worse. During the night, as Za'Zell's body lay on their bed unresponsive, her 7-week-old son begins to cry out in the other room for a feeding. He's hungry. And so William gets up, goes and grabs the baby from his cradle and takes him over to where his mother's lifeless body laid. And he laid the baby onto Za'Zell's chest to be able to feed, which is just... I have no words for that. The next morning was Christmas Day, 2011, a day that Za'Zell Preston had been so excited for, a day that she had been preparing to make so special for her children. And her daughters were at that perfect age where the Christmas magic is still so real. It was also her and William's first Christmas together as a married couple with their own baby together. There were just so many reasons why this day was supposed to be so special. And you know what? Even though Za'Zell had given up on the idea of having a perfect Christmas a long time ago, she at least hoped for a nice one just for her kids. At 8:30 a.m. that morning, Za'Zell's 2 daughters woke up and they were so giddy. They were bouncing around the room. They were so excited to go and open their presents, see what Santa had left for them under the Christmas tree. And it might sound a bit strange that her 8-year-old daughter, who had just witnessed all of that violence the night before, might sound strange to you that she could wake up the next morning and feel so happy and excited for the day, but you have to think how normal this extreme violence had become in their household. The girls would witness their mum being beaten regularly, and it was so incredibly savage. Like, she would have a hugely swollen face, massive gashes in her head, black eyes, but she would always wake up the next morning. There would always be the next day. Despite what that 8-year-old had seen the night before, she expected to wake up and her mum would be probably very roughed up and very tender, but she would be recovering. She would be there. But Za'Zell wasn't responding or recovering at all on Christmas morning. And so what William did next is truly one of the most haunting, disturbing things I have ever heard in a true crime case before in my whole entire life. And you guys know how long I have been looking into cases like this. This is truly something out of a horror film, right? William Wallace goes and picks up Za'Zell's dead body and carries her into the living room. He placed her on the sofa, propped up her body like a life-size doll. He had put sunglasses on her to hide her swollen shut eyes, and then he called in the little girls to come and open their Christmas presents, while their mum's dead body was sat on the sofa watching them. And if that wasn't horrific enough, this demonic man took it one step further than that. Every time you think he can't possibly get any more evil, he does. The girls, of course, noticed very quickly that something was wrong with Mummy. She wasn't reacting, she wasn't talking to them, she wasn't even smiling when they would show her their presents. And they knew that this was very weird. And so William tried to explain her lack of responses by saying, Mummy ruined Christmas. She got drunk and ruined Christmas. But Za'Zell's eldest daughter, the 8-year-old that had witnessed all of that the night before, she could tell that something was seriously wrong with her mum. And when she reached out to touch her, she felt how cold and hard her mum's skin was. She tried speaking to her mum. She called out, Mummy? But Za'Zell didn't respond, because at some point during the early hours of December 25th, 2011, the cold cruelty of her husband's relentless abuse had finally taken the life of Za'Zell Preston. She was only 26 years old, a mother to 3, when her life was snuffed out by William Wallace. And now her body was sitting cold and stiff, dressed up in sunglasses in front of her 3 children while they opened their gifts on Christmas morning. The gifts that she had spent hours picking out and carefully wrapping. Za'Zell's last act as a mother was to make sure that her children woke up on Christmas morning to a massive pile of presents. Presents that she never got to see them open. By this point, William Wallace was really panicking. I think he'd been hoping that Za'Zell was just going to come round, that she was just going to wake up. I mean, that's what always happened. Every time he would beat her unconscious within an inch of her life, but somehow she would recover, she would bounce back, she would be there the next day. But she wasn't coming round this time. It was clear now, well into Christmas Day, that Za'Zell Preston wasn't going to be waking up. Her body was cold and hardening, and William Wallace was quickly realizing that he was a murderer. He had a dead body on his hands, and he was panicking now because what the hell was he gonna do? So at 9 a.m, William Wallace makes a call, and it's not to 911, it's actually to Za'Zell's mother, to tell her that the two of them had gotten into an argument last night and that Za'Zell had drunkenly fallen and hit her head and now she wasn't waking up. He said that she had bled everywhere the night before and she had been unresponsive since 2 a.m. But he hadn't called 911. He had waited until the next morning to call her mum. And in this call to Za'Zell, he didn't even seem fully panicked. He didn't seem like he had a plan to be able to help Za'Zell at all. He was essentially kind of saying to her mother on the phone, "You come round and help." Za'Zell was pleading on the phone with him to call an ambulance to get her daughter some help. And do you want to know what he said? No. He said that he didn't have time. He said that he had to leave and he didn't have time to wait for the responders and to wait and to fill out a whole police report or whatever. He basically had better things to do with his Christmas Day than to try and save his wife's life. For the next 30 minutes, William kept delaying calling 911. He called practically everyone but 911. He called Za'Zell's grandmother, Sally, next, who again begged, pleaded for him to call an ambulance. He was saying to Sally that he knows how bad this looks, so he can't call the police because he would go to prison. Now that terrified Sally to hear on the phone, because if he wasn't a guilty man, then why would that be his first thought? Clearly, her granddaughter is in grave danger if he's already thinking that he could go to prison for what he has done. The next phone call that was made was actually Za'Zell's cousin calling William, because by now the news had travelled through the family. Everyone was panicking. This cousin was just again begging and pleading with William to call an ambulance, and he was very reluctant to. But at this point, the cousin said that he was becoming hysterical over the phone. It was all becoming real now. He had murdered Za'Zell Preston and then staged her body, and now everyone was on their way. Her whole family knew that something was wrong. People were going to be turning up any minute, and he also knew that an ambulance would be there sooner or later, whether he called it or whether someone else did. So at 9:30 a.m, he tried one last time to be one step ahead of everyone else, and he called the ambulance himself. He seemed relatively calm on this phone call. He certainly didn't seem to think that his wife was dead and beyond saving. He was telling the dispatcher that she'd gotten really drunk the night before, she'd fallen and hit her head, and that she might have a concussion, is what he said. But when the paramedics arrived, they instantly knew that something seriously violent had happened in this apartment, because when William met them on the porch outside and led them into the house, there was blood everywhere. There wasn't a single surface that didn't have a smear of blood on it, whether it was old dried blood or even new blood. There were so many different violent attacks that were recorded via different blood smears on everything, on the light switches, the walls, the floors, every countertop, even her children's toys. It was in every single room, her kids' room, on her bedding, on the headboard, on the front door of their apartment. There wasn't a single inch of their home that hadn't seen Za'Zell's pain either from that night or from the years of this abusive relationship. And it was all confirmed to be her blood. There was no question about it. But there was one thing that was very out of place, and that was that her clothes that she was literally wearing had not a speck of blood on them whatsoever. And we know that that is because William had dumped her in the bath and reclothed her to get rid of the evidence that was on her body. The clothes that Za'Zell was wearing were the only things in this whole entire house that didn't have her blood on. And if that's not suspicious, the paramedics knew exactly what kind of situation they had just been called to. They had been called to a murder scene. And so they called the police, who very quickly turned up and arrested William Wallace on suspicion of murder. And when Za'Zell's body was taken in for an autopsy, the list of all her various injuries was devastatingly long. She was absolutely covered in that man's anger. And her final cause of death was a brain hemorrhage due to blunt force trauma. And the evidence in this case was absolutely overwhelming. I mean, it was all over her body. It was all over their apartment. Even her family could all bear witness to the fact that this man had been abusing Za'Zell for years. But even though this seemed like it would be a very slam dunk case to be able to get him in jail and get Za'Zell some justice, the trial would actually see a delay of almost a decade. William would spend the next 9 years just held in jail on a $1 million bond awaiting trial. He was there for 9 years before any proper decisions were made. Now, being held for 9 years without a trial sounds insane. It sounds like a lot, and it is, but there are reasons for this. And to be able to really unpack all of the reasons properly would take a lot of time. We would have to do a whole entire video in itself. So in this video, we are just going to scratch the surface of that. But I did want to try to explain this a little bit because it caught me off guard that he was held for 9 years without any movement in this case. Firstly, William was a black man. And while I am definitely not advocating for William as an individual here, he is definitely guilty. He is definitely evil. And the years that he spent behind bars, those 9 years, are definitely years that he deserves, but it runs way deeper than just William Wallace. This is institutional. A 2002 report found that across America, young black men were about 50% more likely to be detained pre-trial than white defendants. So not only is this a broken system for the black individuals that are accused, but it's also a broken system for the black victims that need justice, like Za'Zell Preston. A lack of movement in Za'Zell's case is a lack of justice for her. Her trial was delayed for nearly a decade. Her family had to sit and wait for that long. A lack of movement in Za'Zell's case is a lack of justice being served to her. Her trial didn't happen for nearly a decade. Her family had to just sit waiting for that long. And this broken system for black victims isn't just in America, it's reflected here in the UK too. Black victims of domestic violence here in the UK are less likely to see their abuser convicted compared to white victims. Between 2016 and 2020, the UK police filed charges in only 6.7% of cases where the abuse victim was white. Now that is low enough in itself that police only filed charges in 6.7% of white cases, but where the victim is black, that percentage is even lower. It drops down to 5.5%. The police are less likely to file charges where the victim is black. But this institutional issue isn't the only thing that William and Za'Zell's trial was going up against. On top of that, another reason for William's 9-year detainment was the fact that the main witness in this case was an 8-year-old child. Za'Zell's oldest daughter had not only witnessed the whole entire attack, but she had been forced to pull glass shards out of her mum's wounds in the middle of it all. She had heard her mother's final noises, those gurgles after her head had hit the toilet. She had watched her mum die at 8 years old. It seems that the courts wanted this little girl to be older before she could give reliable evidence in court, because actually up until this point her story had been changing a little bit here and there. I imagine the reason her story changed a little bit in the beginning was because she was so scared of William Wallace. And I guess for an 8-year-old, there are so many factors at play here. Her mum has just died. Not only that, she watched it happen. And maybe now she was scared of what William Wallace could do to her too if she spoke out and told the truth of what she witnessed. Remember, this little girl had been living in such an abusive environment for years, and William would always threaten Za'Zell that he would kill her if she ever went to the police. He would kill her, he would kill her. And this little girl has heard that so many times, and she has witnessed it with her own 2 eyes. Of course she's going to believe that William Wallace would kill her too. This little girl needed time to be able to process all of this trauma and to be able to grow as a human being without being terrorized by this man's anger and by his threats lingering in her mind. She needed to be able to feel safe when it was time for her to give evidence. So that was a huge reason that this case took so long to go to trial, because it was kind of all resting on this 8-year-old girl's shoulders, and there was no way they were going to put an 8-year-old through all of that. So in March 2021, after an agonizing 9-year wait, Za'Zell's case would finally be heard in court. Even all these years later, William Wallace was maintaining that same story that night Za'Zell just got so belligerently drunk and she picked an argument with him, and then she drunkenly fell over, hit her head, had a concussion. He was sticking to that whole thing. He'd also tried to explain away a bunch of other pieces of evidence, like the smashed glass table. He said that she had thrown herself into it. Like, what? He argued that he never pushed her, she threw herself into it. She was the one that gave herself all those extensive injuries on the day that she died. He just seemed to have excuses for everything. He wasn't at fault for any of the things that happened that night to Za'Zell, which obviously no one believed. And the thing that was going to really do him in here was that Za'Zell's eldest daughter was now 17 years old, and she was ready to tell her truth on the stand. And she stood up there on the stand so bravely and relived the horrors that she had to witness that night at 8 years old. She told the court that on Christmas Eve 2011, she had witnessed William Wallace violently, savagely beating her mother in every room of the house. She saw him push her mother onto the glass table that shattered underneath her after she had tried to escape the apartment. Do you remember? She ran out and he ran after her and dragged her back in. A neighbour saw it happen but didn't do anything about it. Za'Zell's daughter told the court that despite her mum's skin being so badly cut up, sliced from falling onto this glass table, her mum was still alive. And she even relived the part of the story where she was pulling these shards from her mother's wounds. She said that her mother was bleeding badly, but she was still alive, and she probably would have survived if it would have stopped there. But this poor girl was then forced to follow William as he carried her mother into the bathroom and dumped her into this big bath of water. She sat and watched as this man was washing her mother's limp body, lifting her arms to get to the wounds and all the cuts and all the blood all over her. And as this was happening, she could see her mum fading in and out of consciousness. She was coming back and then she would fall back out again. She had lost so much blood. Her body was so weak. And this little girl had to watch every single second of it. But it was while she watched him pull Za'Zell out of the bath that he dropped her. And she witnessed Za'Zell's head smash into the side of the toilet bowl. And she made all of those gurgling noises. And that was the moment she believed her mum died. That William had finally killed her. Her testimony against William Wallace completely lined up with all of the forensic evidence, from the evidence on her mum's body to the evidence at the apartment, even where the blood was in each room. This helped to explain why there was blood like on the front door and in the kids' room and on the headboard of her mum's bed or whatever. The story that this girl told matched all the evidence completely, and it just completely proved William Wallace to be a liar. So on April 7th, 2021, William Wallace was convicted of second-degree murder and domestic abuse. Now, the reason it was second-degree and not first-degree murder is because the actual blow to her head that is believed to have killed her was kind of an accident. It was when he was picking her up from the bath, he slipped, she fell to the ground, and her head smashed against the toilet. Even though he had fully meant every single punch that he had landed on her up until that point, the one that killed her was actually an accident. So maybe there's even a world in which this could have been a manslaughter charge. I mean, don't quote me on that because I'm not educated in the legal system, especially in America. But what really sold it as a murder, second-degree murder charge, was everything else that he did. You know, him putting off calling an ambulance until way into the next day, despite her mum, her grandma, her cousin, everyone begging for him to get help. He was so reluctant to because, well, I guess because he knew it was too late. If he would have called an ambulance in that moment when she fell and hit her head on the toilet and he heard those gurgling noises, if he would have called for an ambulance then, I'm sure things wouldn't have been as bad for him as they were. But he was such an evil person that only cared about himself. He never for 1 second cared about Za'Zell Preston or her kids. There were medics that stood up in this trial and said that if he had called for an ambulance when her head hit the toilet, then there was a good chance that they would have been able to save her. But because he didn't want to involve police, he didn't want to take her for help, he instead left her to die overnight. If an ambulance would have been called, Za'Zell would have been saved, and her kids would still have a mum today. William Wallace was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. An allowance was made for the 9 years that he had already done while he was waiting for his trial, which, strictly speaking, means that he could be out as early as 2027. But in the wake of Za'Zell's death, her grandmother, Sally, said something that really summarised how much William Wallace had drained the life out of this woman even well before he killed her. Sally said that Za'Zell was such an amazing dancer. She loved dancing and had done since she was a kid. Remember, we spoke about that in the beginning? But after she met William Wallace, she never danced again. Instead, he made her life hell. And Za'Zell was trapped in this horrific cycle of abuse that she herself had written about in so many of her college papers. My God, every time I remember that she was in education to be able to counsel victims of domestic violence just like herself, it sends shivers down my spine. It shatters my heart into a million pieces. All this woman wanted to do was to save herself and to save any other women that were in her position. And instead, she was murdered. The last essay that Za'Zell submitted on her college course was actually just a month before William killed her. And in this piece, Za'Zell goes into all the different red flags to look for and the different stages of an abusive relationship, how you can identify that it's getting worse. She wrote, "Firstly comes the tension building phase, which may be accompanied by minor assaults, during which time the woman believes that she can deflect her husband's bullying by conceding to her husband's wishes. Secondly comes the battering episode. At this point, the man is out of control and acts in a rage. And finally, the reconciliation period. Here, the batterer transforms himself into a very apologetic, tender, and loving character." Another element of all of that just breaks my heart is how much her life was consumed with thinking about this kind of shit, because she obviously always felt like she had to protect herself and be one step ahead of whatever he could do to her. That's probably one of the reasons she wanted to be so educated on this. And so even when she's not in the house being abused by him, she's at college thinking about the abuse that she is going through at home. There was never any peace and calm and release for her. So at William Wallace's trial, his friends and family testified that Za'Zell hit him too. They had a mutually violent relationship, supposedly. His cousin said that he had seen William with a black eye and scratches on his face from Za'Zell before. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they were in a mutually abusive relationship. Well, the level of abuse was definitely not mutual. We can tell just from how many hospitalizations Za'Zell had had. There are a lot of potential explanations as for why Za'Zell would have put her hands on him too. You know, reactionary abuse, self-defense. It's more common than you think that the abused becomes an abuser in retaliation to try and stand up for themselves, because they are so used to violence that they start to think, well, why can't I use that back against you? If you're allowed to beat me, give me a black eye, why can't I stand up for myself when you start to get violent? And like Za'Zell's paper talks about, the abuse happens in a cycle, and once a victim has been subjected to that cycle a few times, they start to become hyper aware, and they're able to predict when the different stages are coming. And as that tension grows, they can predict their partner's behaviour. And when an abused woman senses that tension building and senses it coming to the next stage of the abuse cycle, it's not uncommon for her to provoke the man into violence just as a way to get it over with. Like, she knows that it's coming, whether she likes it or not, so she might as well try and get it out of the way. Subconsciously or consciously, a victim might try to speed up the absolute worst and most violent parts of the cycle just to get back to one of the safer parts where things are a bit more mellow, and maybe that's where Za'Zell's physical violence and retaliation might have come in. When an abusive cycle keeps repeating, it becomes like clockwork, and the violence just escalates and escalates until tragically a death like Za'Zell's finally takes place. Which brings me on to the topic of today's charity shout out. We wanted to talk about something a little bit different today. Today we're shouting out a UK-based black feminist organisation called IMCAN. IMCAN is dedicated to stopping violence against black and minority ethnic women and girls. And they do this by collaborating with smaller organisations and charities all across the entire UK. On their website is a directory full of so many useful resources for all women, no matter what your ethnicity or your religion. All women can find something useful on there. In this directory, there are so many websites and so many different numbers that you can call for help. So if you or anyone you know is experiencing abuse, the IMCAN website directory and also our link tree in the description of every single episode is full of resources and numbers and websites and support. And I just want to take this second to let you know that you are loved and you are so much stronger than you think. If you're going through anything like this, or if you're noticing early warning signs, or if you're noticing them in your friends or your friends' partners, please say something. You can help to stop cycles of abuse if you notice these very early red flags. And if you're further into it than that, and it's not about spotting red flags anymore, there are so many different people and organizations that can help you. And like I said, you are stronger than you think. You can do this. You can get out. I believe in you. And this is what Za'Zell felt so passionate about: empowering women and advocating for women that were suffering domestic violence and helping them to find a way out, to find themselves again. She had dreams to spend the rest of her life showing other victims that there is a light at the end of the dark, gloomy tunnel. And those are her own words, which is just so powerful and so heartbreaking. Honestly, that is the bit that's been getting me over the last few weeks, and it's getting me again, just to hear that she had so much hope. The strength of Za'Zell Preston is incredible. And Za'Zell's ambition to educate others has actually found its way into the classroom, into the college classroom that she used to sit in. Her former college tutor always tells Za'Zell's story. To every student that comes through that door, they will be aware of who Za'Zell is and her memory and what kind of woman she was and how strong she was. And they use Za'Zell's story as an example to show that one person cannot make an abusive relationship work. In every abusive relationship, time does not exist. There is always an urgency to leave, and Za'Zell thought that she had more time until all of her time was taken from her. All three of her beautiful children ended up moving in with her mother, Seidel, and they have had a very happy, safe and warm and loving childhood in her home. And even though all three of them had a tortured childhood at the hands of William, I hope they can find peace knowing that their mother has helped so many other women to escape domestic violence and will continue to do so. Za'Zell Preston's story is one that I think needs to be spread far and wide, not only as a warning to other women that are going through something like this, but also as a symbol of hope and strength. Za'Zell was all of that right up until the very last minute. She was an incredible woman. an incredible mother to all 3 of her children, an incredible student, a woman that wanted to make a difference, and my God, is she still doing that. But that is everything we have for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. It really means a lot to us, and like I said, this case has really hit me in the heart for the last few weeks, and I don't think I'll stop thinking about it for a long time. I want to thank our sponsor once again, Skillshare, for making this video possible. Remember, the first 500 of you to click the link down below in the description of this video will get a month free trial of Skillshare. You can take so many amazing classes in that time, so what are you waiting for? Only 500 of you can have it. Go click the link. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up. If you want a free way to support me and the team behind these videos, engaging with the video in some way will help to push it out on YouTube, and that's all we want. That's all we ask. If you leave a thumbs up or a comment, then we're eternally grateful. We read the comments all the time as a team, so I look forward to reading your comments this time as well. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be one on screen for you to click on, or if you want to subscribe to my channel, click the circle with my face in, and make sure you put on the notification bell so you never miss when we upload. Now, with all that being said, have a Merry Christmas, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!